Question 6. Can atheism justify morality? Obviously, someone holding to a naturalistic worldview can live a relatively moral life, but can they objectively justify these actions? Imagine police catch a thief in the act of stealing money. In the process of arresting him, he objects, "Wait, I think this is perfectly okay." So who's right? A moral objection is disapproval that appeals to a moral standard or law as its basis. In this instance, it's pretty easy to say that the criminal is wrong. Although he feels like it wasn't wrong to steal the money, the law says that it is wrong. Despite his objection, the criminal's subjective feelings don't supersede the objective written laws. But let's take it one step further. What if he then says that he thinks the law itself is wrong? Now who's right? These types of objections often arise between people of various worldviews. Atheists, for example, will condemn teachings of a holy book, but by what standard are they basing their criticism? Theistic worldviews hold that morality comes from the very nature of God. This is a fundamental standard that is true for all people throughout all time. So if there is no God, can this truly objective morality exist? We'll hear some of the best arguments from 3 leading proponents of atheism. We can get an idea of how truthful a worldview is by asking if it is intellectually consistent. Here are some of the most common standards which atheists point to as a bedrock for their morality. Some say morality is simply an outworking of Darwinian evolution. Others say that morality is determined by what increases flourishing while diminishing suffering. Some might simply say that a majority vote is what determines what is right and what is wrong. And lastly, as an increasingly popular approach, some derive their morality from personal pleasure. Before we begin, here's something important to keep in mind. At the very core of what is true, we have reality. In order to even begin to understand reality, we have to assume some basic metaphysical truths that can't necessarily be proven themselves. Beyond that, we get into the study of epistemology, or how we know things. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if we think we have a grip on epistemology or metaphysics if we don't fundamentally understand reality. In the theistic worldview, the objective nature of morality comes from the eternal, transcendent mind of God. Putting aside some strawman arguments that misunderstand the nature of God, nothing can be more fundamental than this standard for morality. Let's take a closer look at some of these naturalistic approaches. Does morality come from purely natural processes? In his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins has this to say. In ancestral times, we had the opportunity to be altruistic only towards close kin and potential reciprocators. Nowadays, the restriction is no longer there, but the rule of thumb persists. Do not, for one moment, think of such Darwinizing as demeaning or reductive of the noble emotions of compassion and generosity. Let's put this to the test. What does it take to be intellectually consistent when it comes to evolutionary morality? When it comes to things like rape, murder, or slavery, it's not really wrong if it assists in the survival of the species. It's also okay if the strong murder the weak. It's natural. And if the strong benefit from enslaving the weak, that's just the course of nature. This tactic attempts to describe how we know things, but for some reason it doesn't seem to sit right with most of us in our experience of how things really are. If this theory is correct, we could just as well have developed the exact opposite views of morality. Our view of what is inherently wrong is really just another way of describing things that don't help us survive. Does anyone actually live this out? Does anyone actually believe this? As we've seen from the Darwinian standpoint, virtually nobody is intellectually consistent. What about the intuitive idea of human flourishing? This is a summary of an interaction between Dr. Frank Turek, a Christian apologist, and Michael Shermer, founding publisher of Skeptic magazine. For the full debate, you can find the link at the end of this episode. After hearing Schirmer's presentation of evolutionary morality, Dr. Turek asked why Hitler's morals were inherently wrong if they too were a product of evolution. Schirmer says it was wrong because people were exterminated and their rights were removed. To further the point, the question again had to be asked, why is that wrong? Schirmer argues that each of us have been born with a natural instinct to survive. Turek points out that somebody like Stalin may have just preferred to kill to get what he wanted. So why was that wrong? Schirmer admits while that may benefit the individual, we want to benefit the collective. Why is that? Why not benefit the individual rather than the collective? Schirmer says that psychopaths don't dictate the arc of the moral universe. It moves towards individual autonomy and freedom. But again, he's still missing the point. Why is that good? What is the objective moral standard? To which Schirmer concludes, well, by the standard that evolution granted us the right. Schirmer says in his book, "Thus I take moral progress to mean the improvement in the survival and flourishing of sentient beings." He fails to ask the fundamental question. Why assume survival is good? Who gets to define flourishing? Why are sentient beings more valuable than non-sentient beings? From Schirmer's naturalistic point of view, he wants you to trust his method of reasoning toward right and wrong. We see the same kind of logic from Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. He says, questions about values, about meaning, morality, and life's larger purpose, are really questions about well-being of conscious creatures. Values, therefore, translate into facts that can be scientifically understood. But fellow atheist Sean Carroll points out the obvious flaws in the assumption that this is a truly objective standard of morality. He says to Sam Harris, there are, quote, ethical questions and meta-ethical questions. You seem to say there is a principle. Do we agree you're not deriving that principle from what is? You're introducing a new assumption. It's just not science. Like Schirmer, Harris wants you to believe that his core beliefs about morality should be true for everyone. He fails to ask the much more fundamental questions, such as, why is life valuable in the first place? Why are sentient beings any more significant than non-sentient beings if you're holding to a materialist worldview? As we've seen in these first two cases, these standards don't hold up when pushed to the extremes. They also fail to answer the most fundamental questions of all. For the sake of time, we won't get into the details of these other approaches, but the same faulty logic is present. Ask yourself, if 51% of people agreed slavery, murder, or rape were a good thing, would they be inherently right? In the same way, if it made me happy to rape, murder, etc., does that make it right? So what's the practical implication of all this? Back at our original illustration, consider this. From the atheistic perspective, if you are to truly remain intellectually consistent, there is no justification for objecting to anyone's actions, no matter how evil. In order to object, you are simply forcing your personal opinion onto somebody else. Cognitive dissonance can come about when somebody holds two contradictory beliefs at the same time. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? Richard Dawkins believes that the universe, at bottom, contains no evil and no good. And yet, he has an utter hatred for the God of the Bible, describing him as jealous, petty, unjust, unforgiving, control freak, vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, and so on and so forth. For when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. The moment you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are, in fact, measuring them both by a standard. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either. If your moral ideas can be truer, and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality, for them to be true about.